did he do it? What was his childhood like? Now, I'd like to show you something worse.
Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I am Sherrilyn and I am so glad you found me. If you're not new here, welcome back. Thank you for joining me every single upload. Every single one I love and I appreciate you so much. All right, we're getting right into it. As you can tell by the thumbnail, we're talking about Ed Gein today. And I guess, also with the Netflix monster and them covering Ed Gein this time, I'm kind of like doing a lot of things that I don't usually do. I don't usually talk about like notorious serial killers, or I don't know, I guess like want to give like more attention to something that I think can like cross the lines of being unethical and upset people. Something about Ed Gein and this like whole installment felt different that I watched it because I've opted out of the past 2 monster installments on Netflix. But yeah, something felt different about this one. I also think that maybe because there's so many questions still, even though we think that we know so much. And then after seeing it, it caused me to go down like a rabbit hole, but even like pouring into like old newspaper articles from like when this happened. And then there was an element, I think, of me also like really liking and respecting like Charlie Hunnam and Laurie Metcalf. So I felt like, all right, if actors are going to take this on, I felt like they were going to do it as respectful as possible. So I don't know how I feel about it. I know that there's obviously an element of needing things to be like over embellished for the entertainment aspect of it. But I feel like when you're making up victims, not necessarily making them up, but like claiming them as Ed Gein victims and like scenarios that didn't happen, that felt icky. I feel like Ed Gein's story is not one that needs any form of embellishment because it's already insane enough. Yeah, that's kind of where I was, and I wanted to talk about it and kind of go through like what's true from what we know, and like what's not that we definitely know from the show. All right, so what we know. Okay, let's go back to who Ed Gein was. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27th, 1906 in La Crosse County in Wisconsin. He was the younger of 2 sons. His older brother, Harry, was 5 years older than him, and they were born to George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine. Their family life was a total disaster, okay? Mostly thanks to the parents. When they were in La Crosse, Ed's father worked as a carpenter, a tanner, and a firefighter, I believed. He also owned a local grocery store, but then sold the business. They left the city and the family went to live on a 155-acre farm near Plainfield, Wisconsin when Ed was 7. I had no idea it was that huge. 155 acres, insane. Like today's market value, what in the shit? Them moving to this farm and basically like pure isolation, like think of like that many acres too. This was a worst case scenario for Ed and his brother because the isolation allowed their unhinged mother to have complete control over them. Augusta was super religious, incredibly controlling, and verbally abusive to the boys. And when I'm saying like super religious, I'm saying like the type where it's like everything that you don't want in religion, like the fear mongering, the control. I feel like really emphasizing fear. And then also like, that's the devil. And like, we're so much greater. I'm so much greater. And like, if you even like look at these people, like you're going to hell, like just scared of everything, and like made it so her sons like only had her. The father also contributed a lot of trauma that was through abuse, beatings so bad that there were times that Ed's ears would ring from being hit so hard. And then Augusta's was more verbal and psychological. She was always using fear and like degrading to control her children. One of the main things that she did was really have them fear like the world. Like she was like, the world like is just full of sinners, and you know what? I get it. Like, I'm sure there is just an element of that, Augusta, but it was like, they couldn't even have friends. It was like, don't even look there. You're going to die. And if they did try to go play with somebody, they'd be punished. So they never really even developed those like social or even like their own like external identities of being outside of like who they were as like Augusta's children. They also didn't have any other support system. Ed rarely left the property. It was pretty much only when he was attending school. He went to Roche Cree grade school. This was like a tiny one-room building with 12 students. He is described as shy, socially awkward. His classmates and teachers remembered him laughing to himself at like his own private jokes. He also had like a growth on his eye, so it was like caused him to like have like a lazy eye and a lesion on his tongue that made him speak strangely. I will say it sounds like people saw like Ed's heart though, I guess maybe like they thought like, okay, yeah, like he's odd enough, but kind of went over and above to be kind. I will say, kind of going into the future of his story, his eye did like affect like certain things in his life. And the only time that he really was able to travel far away from the farm was in 1942 when he was 36 years old and he was eligible for the draft. And so he traveled to Milwaukee, got a physical exam, and then he was rejected because of like the growth on his eye impairing his vision. So that was like the one time he's like able to like get out. This is when he's like, 36 years old. And then essentially like had no choice but to, go back to the farm. Going back to school though, in terms of academics, he was smart, especially good at reading. He was really into reading. He went to school until the 8th grade when he was 14 years old, dropped out of school, but kept reading. I feel like that is important because that's also something that is the type of books and stuff like that is like what is also a big focus in Monster. Now, on top of Augusta not letting the boys have any friends, she also taught them that like women specifically, except for her, were evil and sinful. Okay, so like although yeah, like you're not even allowed to have like friends if they're boys, it was like, oh, like do not even think of being interested in a woman or talking to a woman. And this, I learned, was a toxic conditioning that experts call the Madonna whore complex, which basically places women into two categories, which is the Madonna, which is like a woman who is pure, nurturing. That would be like where Ed's mom, I guess, would be, even though us looking in is like the way that she treated her children was not nurturing, but it's all they knew. And then the whore aspect of it was, a woman who is over-sexual, manipulating, promiscuous, like you're going to hell if you associate with them. Ed did follow that. Like he did see his mom as a, pure goddess and every other woman was this evil sinner, which having this very warped view kind of led to the main reasons he killed the women that he did and chose the bodies that he did when he dug them up. It's so sad that despite the fact that his mom was verbally abusive to him, told him virtually every day that she hated him because he wasn't the daughter that she wanted, Ed particularly idolized her. Obviously, we have that upbringing and scenario as the catalyst for what led Ed to do what Ed did. I also think that it's important to kind of like recognize the decade leading up to his crimes because it was one loss after another. And I think that was like each one was like pushing Ed closer to like the edge. And it started with George, his father. So in the very last years, he was virtually like bedridden and, useless, which left the upkeep of the farm and the family really hard because he drank away the majority of the family earnings. He ended up dying on April 1st, 1940 when he was 66 years old. I think it was like a form of pneumonia. You'd had like fluid on his lungs. And for reference in time, Ed is 33 when this happened. Even though George was a terrible father, his death, I mean, it's pretty much all the boys knew, right? Like they knew like just like the family. So it's like kind of losing their father. It's like, okay, now we're just down to us and Augusta. And since he died and Augusta had lost her main target of hatred, because yes, she did give like a lot to Ed and Henry, but she was also kind of like molding them to like be everything that like she wanted and like go by like her beliefs. And with George, she just like utterly hated him and made sure that he also knew that every day, which, I mean, based on what we know about him, he sounded like he needed to be told that he was not a good person. Anyways, after he died, all of that abuse fell even further on to Ed and Henry, but it didn't push Ed away though. He became even closer to her. I do think though that Henry had more of an identity than Ed and was starting to like really push back. And I think some of the opportunity for him to allow to like see other things was after their father had died, because it left a lot of providing for the farm and having like the upkeep and stuff on them. So they would take on odd jobs to pay for those expenses. Ed particularly loved babysitting jobs. He enjoyed being around kids because they were easy to relate to. And it sounds like the parents of the children that he babysat also like really loved Ed. They both, Ed and Henry, were considered trustworthy and reliable by the people in town. There's an article that I came across loss from 1951 where they describe Ed as somebody who went out of his way to be kind. He was honest, reliable, and above all, truthful. After their father's death, 4 years later in 1944, another huge loss to Ed, Henry, his brother, under super suspicious circumstances, dies. So Ed said that he and Henry were burning brush on like the marshland near their house, and a fire supposedly got out of control. And while Ed and Henry were fighting the fire, Ed reported that he had been unable to locate Henry, like that they were on opposite ends of where this fire was, like trying to like contain it, and lost Henry. And he reported him missing to the police. And when the police arrived, allegedly Ed led them right to where Henry's body was. So they were like, oh, I thought he was missing. But then immediately he was like, there he is. He's right here. So despite the cause of death not being consistent with injuries from a fire, like meaning like it doesn't sound like he was like caught up in this fire and like burned, Henry's body had not been touched by the fire. His head was badly bruised though. And the coroner listed Henry's cause of death as asphyxiation, and no autopsy was ever done. Okay, so it was just like, all right, this was attributed from the fire, like the smoke of a fire, and like he passed out and died and from breathing in all the smoke. But he had this like bruise on his head. Now the police, it sounds like they didn't even, there was probably just like an explanation like, oh, it must have been like when he like lost consciousness and like fell and hit his head, which also very well could be true. There was just not an inkling in their mind that there was any foul play when they knew that like Ed and Henry were together. It wasn't like Ed saw something and they were like, oh, like there's like this madman on the loose or something and had gotten to Henry. There wasn't like a realm in their possibility of like thinking that Ed was capable of killing someone. It sounds like I just don't even think that they thought about it. They were just like, oh, there's an explanation. And then not long after Henry's death, Augusta had a stroke, and allegedly this already was devastating enough for Ed, and he was adamant on being the one to care for her. And then he did. He cared for her back at their house. And then a year after Henry's death, Ed's world ended when Augusta died on December 29th, 1945 from complications of a second stroke. She was 67 years old and Ed was 39 at the time. And after she died, he was completely alone on this farm. And he would try to like, you know, just make like small earnings here and there from like the odd jobs that he was doing before to sustain it, but stayed on the farm. This loss was so profound for him that he left his mom's room untouched. He also left the sitting room that she spent a lot of time in exactly how it was, you know, like right when she died. It was basically this like pristine shrine. And then the rest of the house became kind of like this disgusting mess. Ultimately, I think there was a point where things got, I don't know if they got more organized. He ended up boarding up like all but 2 of the rooms of the house and never opened them again until his arrest. So he was just living in this like small area off the kitchen, and then basically like kept everything else like closed off and kind of almost just like ready for his mom. Allegedly, before her death, Augusta had some concerns about the things that Ed was reading. There were allegations that he was reading about like head shrinking, grave robbing, and a lot of books on human anatomy that she expressed, you know, like that she did not like. And then after she died, this interest apparently, you know, quickly turned into like really dark stuff, poured into all of that kind of material that he wasn't reading until after her death. And that led to, his crime sprees that went from around 1947 to 1957. Ed said about 18 months after Augusta died, he was, I guess, driven by this intense loneliness that she, you know, not only was everybody else gone, but specifically she was gone. And he started seeing these like strange visions that led him to visiting the cemetery where she was buried. I have heard conflicting things about her being buried. I know for sure he wasn't able to like dig her up. I believe there was like an attempt though, and that's something, it was maybe like the way that the coffin was sealed. There's a lot out there to like try to sift through, but he would spend a lot of time near her grave. After several visits, he decided to dig up other corpses. So we know that on at least 9 occasions, Ed dug up the coffins of newly buried middle-aged women that he had seen in the obituaries. So this is what's crazy too, is that, I mean, it's crazy that you would go and dig up graves and want to take the bodies and stuff like that. But he would like open them up thinking like, okay, like this is who I'm looking for. Another thing to note is that it said that like these women looked a lot like his mother, like he was looking for somebody that resembled his mother. But if he opened it up and they didn't, he'd just like, you know, like rebury and be like, okay, like on to the next one and look for somebody else. And then when he did find the victims that he felt looked enough like his mom, he would take them and go and make items out of their remains. Another misconception is, from what we know based on Ed's telling, is besides pleasuring himself, he denies ever having a sexual experience in his life and stated that he had never ever had sex with any of the bodies because he said, quote, they smelled too bad. This went on for a couple years where Ed would make bowls out of people's skulls, lampshades out of skin. We'll get into like the catalog. Again, there's also kind of like conflicting things about that. We'll get into that in a little bit. But it ultimately came to the point where clearly the grave robbing wasn't enough for Ed. This escalated. And in 1951, Ed allegedly met his first victim, Mary Hogan, when he went into her bar. Mary is described as a middle-aged woman that did look a lot like Ed's mother. People said that they looked alike. Their personalities and lifestyles were very different. Mary had this bar and apparently a bit of a potty mouth, and Augusta was not like that. And Ed apparently was transfixed on her because of the resemblance to his mother, but then also like seeing these like vast differences between the two of them. 3 years after Ed met Mary, on December 8th, 1954, she went missing. And police had suspected foul play because there was blood on the floor next to a empty bullet shell casing. And the last person on, again, with this, suspicion, the last person on anyone's suspect list was Ed, even with him making an alleged confession the day after she was last seen. Apparently, he was working with a man named Elmo Ewick, and Ed told him that he shot Mary and that he had hung her up at his house. And Elmo just kind of listened to him and then dismissed it. And he was just like, oh, Eddie is what a lot of people called him, and was just like, you little fibber, you, and just didn't believe him. Then almost exactly 3 years after Mary's disappearance on November 15th, 1957, Mary had gone missing on December 8th, 1954, Ed went into Warden's, which was a local hardware store, and asked Bernice Warden about the price of a gallon of antifreeze. And apparently her son, Frank Warden, who was the local deputy, happened to be in the store as well. And once Ed got the price, he said, okay, I'll come back tomorrow and buy it. The next day, November 16th, Bernice disappears from her store. So her son, the deputy, and the sheriff as well had gone to the store and found the cash register open, blood on the floor, and a .22 caliber rifle that was out of place on its rack. I think it was like in there like for protection, and it was out of place. And when they looked at the receipt log, they saw that the last sale of the day was for antifreeze made out to Ed Gein. So at this point, it's like, okay, that's really all they have to go off of, is that, you're going with the last person, Ed. And I think that it was feeling like routine. Like, did you see anybody in the store when you were there? So the deputy and the sheriff, so the deputy being Bernice's son, go to Ed's house. And on the property is, I've seen it described as like a shed, also a summer kitchen, also a latch through. No, that's not the right word. We'll write it right here. There's a word for it. That's how they referred to it in like the articles, like when this was all happening. Basically, it was like in today, it sounds like just like, yeah, like a shed. They go into the shed and they see Bernice's body, missing its head, hanging upside down with her ankles attached to like this wooden crossbeam. I feel like the least graphic way to explain it is she was field dressed like a deer. So like the process of removing its internal organs. That was still really graphic. Apologies. I can't even imagine what the horror of that would have been for her son specifically. And then on top of that, leading into the house and them finding all of the things that they found. So there were human skulls in multiple places, some that were like attached to the post of Ed's bed. There was a box of organs. There was furniture made out of bones and skin. There were masks. The masks were like the skin portion of the head that had been like pulled away and, preserved. They also found a belt with nipples, allegedly. This has also kind of been, I have seen more reports that actually was a thing, but then you also have people being like, that one was like, had just got lost in translation and embellished. And then there was like also leggings made from skin, as well as a vest with like breasts attached, pieced together. Ed is obviously taken into custody and confessed to killing the missing tavern owner, Mary Hogan, as well as Bernice Warden. For Mary's death, Ed said that he had been hanging out with her, drinking a little bit, and then he just kind of pulled the blinds and put a gun to her forehead and shot her. He also shot Bernice, and the autopsy confirmed that, yes, she died of a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. Now, according to an article released the day after the discovery, they said that Ed had his hands not I don't think it was described as up. It was kind of just haphazardly, I did it, and then apparently said, I've been killing for 7 years, but then only confessed to Mary and Bernice, and then admitted to robbing graves, and that's where all of the, remains around the house had come from. So that I had never known until I went through those old articles that there was ever mention of a number of people. And so that has stuck with me, that when I've kind of gone back and forth, I also think about the fact that I do think that he is also overly truthful. So it's was that him being really truthful in the moment, or was he also equating killing into this dismembering of the graves that he had dug up? And at first, authorities didn't even believe the grave robbing confession. It wasn't until they dug up the graves that Ed had told them and saw that the caskets were empty that they believed him. They also went to some of the graves that he decided not to take the remains, and then they could see that they had recently been opened. So it was at that point that they were like, okay, you are telling the truth. Now, initially, Ed was taken to a judge and only technically being charged with robbery. The murder charges were held back in order to determine his sanity, which I'm actually quite surprised about in that age, in the late 1950s. Your mental health and sanity and all that wasn't always considered. But I feel yeah, you'd probably be Ed, you were so chill, babysitting our kids. What in the fork is this? When you would go through his house. So that makes sense. Anyways, the psychologist and the psychiatrist who interviewed Ed, they believed that he was schizophrenic and also a sexual psychopath. It was Dr. E.F. Schubert who interviewed Ed, who had found that Ed had an abnormally magnified attachment to his mother, and recommended to the judge that Ed was insane and should be permanently committed to the Central State Hospital, which he was. Ed spent 10 years in the institution until he was deemed competent enough to stand trial. In order to prepare for the trial, it took almost a year. It was 9 months to go through everything. And then the actual trial only lasted 1 week. By the end of it, on November 14th, 1968, Ed was found guilty of the first-degree murder for the shooting of Bernice Warden. The court also found that on the day of the shooting, Ed was not sane. Therefore, they concluded that he was not guilty for reasons of insanity, and he went back to the Central State Hospital. He was never convicted for Mary's death, but he confessed to it. There's at least one time that we know of where Ed was wanting to be released from the hospital in February 1974 when he was 68 years old. He filed a petition claiming that he was recover and that his mental health was, tip-top shape. He was fully competent and that there was no reason why he should remain in any hospital. And the judge that reviewed that petition ordered a re-examination, and then based on those findings, his petition was rejected and he was returned back to the Central State Hospital. In 1978, when he was 72, he did move to the Mendota Mental Institute in Madison, and that's where he stayed until he died on July 26, 1984, when he was 78 years old. Allegedly, he was quite senile after a long battle with cancer. He died of respiratory failure in the geriatric ward of that last hospital that he was transferred to. People at the hospital people describe him as a model patient. He was mild-mannered, literally exactly how people in the town that knew him described him as. There were even 4 of like the hospital attendants who were there when he was laid to rest next to his mother at the Plainfield Cemetery. After Ed's arrest, the farm and personal property were scheduled for auction, and then it never ended up happening. And this was probably it was a really good thing. And this was actually something that the locals were not wanting to go through. They did not want this auction off. They just knew, like, based on the coverage that it got and like the horrors within the house, like it was so unbelievable that this would become an attraction to like their small town. And they didn't have to worry about it. It never went to auction because a fire destroyed it in very early hours of the morning on March 30th. And it sounds like it was just kind of like, yeah, okay, well, there was a fire. Lord Jesus, there's a fire. Oh no, not the time, Sherrilyn. Yeah, so it was never really investigated. It was just kind of like, yeah, all right, well, that's that. And so that this will kind of tie into kind of like where we are like in today's society with like artifacts and stuff like that. All right, so how does this story, as factual as we could possibly be right now, I'm so sorry if I'm sure that there are people who are super, super informed when it comes to Ed Gein. I'm just going based off of like kind of like old articles and like piecing together as much as I possibly can. Also, we've got like mixed information, suspicions, all that stuff. But, if you know some things or I need to be correct on anything, please let me know. But I kind of want to compare this to, the show Monsters. And I feel like off the bat, I guess like the basics were right. Okay. So clearly the show really leans into that relationship with his mom. And it is the core of that story as well as Ed's real story. Okay. Like, yes, she was hyper religious. She was totally domineering, basically brainwashed him to think that any other connection besides hers was like evil. And especially women, they were all sinners. And when she died, it was almost like that was like the only connection that he really had. And it just kind of like sent him into a spiral. Can you imagine being that old? Your only friend is also your mother. You're also looking at her at like even a higher level of like obsession is gone. And you're a grown adult, but like so stunted and have no social skills, there was no identity there besides the one that she had created. And then she was gone. They also, clearly focus a lot on the house. It seems like most of that was like horror enough, shocking enough, like what was there, the way that he was living. I feel like, didn't need to embellish that. Same with the grave robbing, although it does show him being intimate with the bodies once he brought them home. And that is something that Ed has denied doing. The show also obviously follows the 2 murders that Ed confessed to, Bernice and Mary, but then they also throw in other murders. Now, he was never charged or confessed to any other murders besides those 2, but in the show it portrays Ed as murdering several others. They have him killing his brother Henry. We know in hindsight that there were injuries that didn't add up to a brush fire, but it was officially ruled an accident. The show also depicts him killing these 2 hunters, a nurse, and a babysitter. The babysitter was played by Addison Rae, and I will say, girl, good for you. Like, coming from those TikTok days, like, what a cool thing to see, like, somebody live out their dreams and just like be so good at it. Like, she's phenomenal. So the real cases around this time that many people have wondered about are Georgia Weckler. She was 8 years old and disappeared without a trace on May 1st, 1947. There allegedly were no suspects, and the only clue found was tire tracks of a Ford. Now, Ed did have a 1940, why does that sound wrong? 1949 Ford sedan. From what I know, the car is unaccounted for to this day, after a man named Bunny Gibbons bought it not long after Ed's arrest. And I think he tried to like make a business like touring it around the States. And then I think he was stopped from doing that. And then don't know where he put it. Don't know if it's been passed down into the family. We don't know. I think to this day, this car is unaccounted for. Just a little bit of side information. In the show, they have Ed killing these 2 male hunters. And that is based off the disappearance of Victor Bunk Travis, who was 42, and his friend Ray Burgess. and they disappeared on November 1st, 1952 after spending several hours at a local bar in Plainfield, and there was no trace of them or their car ever found. You can say that like kidnapping men was out of Ed's character, but after what they found and just like how like gruesome and I feel like, you know, like unpredictable, like based on like the character that they had seen from Ed, it kind of sounds like they were just like, well, who's to say that this wasn't him? So there was a point where police suspected that he could have had a role in their disappearance, and I believe a lot of people to this day still do as well. Then on October 24th, 1953, Evelyn Hartley, who was 15 years old, was abducted while babysitting for family friends. This is who like Addison Rae's character is based off on the show, and they have Ed killing her. Investigators did recover several items of clothing in the area, including a pair of men's trousers, as well as a bloody jacket, bra, and then some other garments that were stained with blood. The blood stains on some of the items were tested to the point of matching Evelyn's blood type, not like her specific DNA profile, if I'm not mistaken. So there is suspicion that Ed was involved somehow. However, when they did search his property, there was no trace of Evelyn's remains there and no items, you know, like that tied her to like being there at any point. Nor her remains nor other items of hers were found on the farm. Allegedly, he was questioned specifically about her disappearance, and he passed 2 lie detector tests and was officially cleared of any involvement in her case. I go back and forth. Like I said, I do believe that he was overly truthful, and like, because even with the police, like, finding, being like, yo, Ed, we saw what's in your house. What is that? Like, he was just like, oh, yeah, that's the grave robbing. And there was no point really in his interviews where it was like, I'm not speaking. And he was quite honest, like, even like about his relationship with his mother and how he viewed like sex. And there wasn't really a lot of like question, I feel like. So I don't know. That's what makes me think of, especially like the 2 men and then the younger girls and the babysitter as well. None of those fit like the MO. So I don't know. We'll never know. Right now, all we know, like fact-based at this point with evidence, is that there was 2 murders that he confessed to, confirmed, but there are at this point like 7 other suspected that he could have murdered and 9 corpses that he had mutilated. So then also, this is kind of like where I also had the issues, but I get it, like kind of like for the show aspect, you've got like, you're now cranking up the drama for things like the Ted Bundy, like FBI crossover. There was a plot line where Ed, you know, is in the hospital and helps the FBI catch Ted Bundy, which did not happen. There's 0 evidence that he talked to anybody about the case, let alone like cracked it. This is what really bothered me about the show, was there was a romantic sexual relationship that was portrayed in the show between Ed and his final victim, Bernice Worden. And from what we know, this is highly unlikely. After Ed was arrested and through these, you know, months of psychiatric evaluation, doctors, it wasn't, you know, specifically to Bernice, but they had said like Ed as a whole, he had no history of sexual relationships or contact. And he himself told investigators that he had never had any intercourse with anybody. He claimed that he found women very intimidating and admitted that like his overly religious upbringing, especially like his mom in his ear about like how sinful and evil sex and women were, and like literally said, like looked at women as like instruments of the devil. Like he was very confused about sex and intimacy and like did not know where to place that or even like attempt to explore it like with a person, based on my understanding. Obviously, yes, he did things like exhumed female bodies and then created these like suits, you know, would lead to like this like sexualized or like fetish component to things, but there is no verified evidence that he ever had intercourse, even with the bodies. I think even the term that he used with like the medical team was he never went all the way. So like even that kind of like brings you kind of like to like where like his mentality was. Yeah, that one really, really got me. Like for Bernice, it's like, I don't know why I felt like it was unnecessary to like have this like relationship there, period. period. So that kind of also leads into the implication that he and the character Adeline Watkins were as close as the show portrayed them, because there was an Adeline Watkins, and that one I kind of get a little bit though, because like she did speak to media. However, in the show, this definitely looks like not only his love interest, but also this like kind of like almost like the puppet master and like an accomplice of sorts, like her being like the one like, look at this, you know, like getting all of these like bad thoughts. Maybe that is kind of like an element of like pulling in like the way that his mom explained women anyways, and then you've got this figure who's like virtually like everything that she is saying. I don't know. It was so odd. But yeah, there was an Adeline Watkins, and she was described as like a quiet neighbor who gave inconsistent interviews about her relationship with Ed. Initially, she did an interview where she said like she loved Ed. They had this like 20-year like connection. He even proposed to her, but she turned him down. And then a month later, she said that that original story that she had given to like the Tribune was blown out of proportion and contained untrue statements. And then she said like neither her nor her mother, who was also interviewed in that first one, said that, you know, there was any connection or that they ever said like he was sweet and kind. And Shirley, she said, was not her sweetheart. She also said that it was not a 20-year connection, but that he had called on her a few times in the span of about 7 months, and that they had gone to like the movies a couple times. That was interesting. I'll have like those articles if you want to like pause and read some of it on the screen. Those were like pulled from like archives from like that time. Then they have I want to get the name right, Ilsa connection. And so again, she was a real person. She is everything that Augusta was talking about. I will give Augusta that. This broad is probably who she was feeling around that time, like just pure evil. She was a Nazi war criminal who also allegedly made items from human skin. And so they kind of like say that she was like the inspiration to like Ed Gein for like doing that. And obviously there are similarities. We're talking about like real life evidence. If Ed, you know, had any knowledge of her, we don't know. Like there wasn't, as far as I know, again, correct me if I'm wrong, him mention her at all or have like any like reading materials or anything like that about her. I will say though, I do think that that was a opportunity to spread awareness of how evil and disgusting she was for people who did not know, like myself. Like I ended up going through a rabbit hole because I had no idea who she was, and her trials took place in the 1940s. They were international news stories, so we do know that Ed was an avid reader, and you know, he had this obsession with like crime stories and anatomy, and so yeah, there's a possibility that he could have known about her. I'm just saying, like, there was never, you know, while he's talking to like investigators or even like his medical team, was he ever just like, so this is where I got that idea from. I think the show also used kind of like that platform as like an information tool when it came to Christine Jorgensen as well. And that was, I guess, like acknowledging the misconception that like the woman's suit that Ed Gein had made had to do with like transgender identity. So the show, it debunks like this theory by having Christine tell Ed like he's not trans, but he's a genophile. And I think making it clear to like the viewers that his motivation was like fetish and not because he was transgendered. So I think really what that scene was doing was, you know, countering any misinformation about trans people. And that one I will accept, because I do think that was more, or like not at all like trans related at all, but more like of a fetish confusion. You've also got like the voices that he's hearing, whether like he's believing some of that is like his mother and stuff, you know, like trying to like reconnect with her. I do think that was more confusion, not about like his sexuality or identity. And then we have like my least favorite part, but I guess like all, you know, it's ties in because Ed's story is like influential for like a lot of Hollywood movies, you know, like horror and stuff like that. So there was like a lot of time spent on like the Alfred Hitchcock and Anthony Perkins, like who played Norman Bates in Psycho. And I found that really confusing. And I actually saw like a lot of conversations online of people also finding that confusing. So I didn't feel so alone, because it just kind of like kept bouncing back to timelines, but then also like being kind of like inserted into, you know, like with Ed Gein. It was a lot. All we know for sure is yes, Ed Gein was like, I guess like a foundation starting point of Psycho. We've got like the whole mother fixation. We know Ed Gein absolutely pathologically obsessed with his mother. And that was kind of like the fixation and like the defining feature of like Norman Bates as well. Like, oh my gosh, like I watched the original Psycho every single October. I always wonder like what that would have been like in that era to like watch that. But I just think it's so well done. And like him just being like, mother. Anyways. And then obviously we have like the costume. Ed made and wore women's suits out of human skin, you know, where Norman Bates was like dressing up as his mother. But yeah, I don't think that it was like as heavily influenced as the show Monsters portrayed, of being like, you know, like Anthony Perkins really needed to like take in Ed Gein himself and like go in this replica of the house and see all the gruesome things that were inside. There's, you know, zero evidence of that. And even the author, Robert Bloch, said that Norman Bates was not directly based on Ed Gein. He just said that he pulled like the inspiration of like, it's like a case of a man, you know, the man next door that could commit these types of crimes that he found was most terrifying. And Norman's character is like definitely like that. He's like this, like appears to just be like this, like very like soft spoken, timid, meek little, you know, little hotel guy. Meow, meow, meow. And then he's just full-blown shower scene. When the fork is that? Also, I think it's important to remember that when he wrote Psycho, there was no access to like the full details of Ed's crimes. So he just at this point was like pulling inspiration from like, you know, this guy being isolated, repressed, you know, he's dominated by his mother and he's living like this double life. Then we also have another character that is based off, influenced, inspired by Ed. I think this one would maybe be, no, not even. I was going to say that like most compare, not even. Only like for the skin stuff. And that is Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. And he was, you know, that character was trying to create this like full woman suit. For him, that character was like, yes, obviously there's that comparison, but then it was also like he was pulled from like several other killers to like form this one terrifying, creepy ass puts the lotion on monster. And then obviously we have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the director Tobe Hooper connection. That scene in Monsters, like on Netflix, the Ed Gein story on Monsters, I was like, what is going on? I guess I didn't really know too much of like the backstory of it. So there was a point where when he's like having that daydream, for anyone who hasn't seen this is not gonna know what I'm talking about, but there's a scene where it's like Toby and he's like standing in line at this department store and he like sees this chainsaw and then just just picks it up and starts like killing everybody in line waiting and then snaps out of it. But that scene was holy. I was like, what is happening? Anyways, that is obviously loosely inspired again, because yes, Leatherface making lampshades out of, you know, human skin, making like the skin mask and stuff like that. But then in the same sense, it's like there's also Leatherface does so much more. Ed didn't trap all of these like college students and I don't know. Anyways, you get it. It's the Hollywood thing. It does what it does. I just felt there's too much focus on it. I get it. I get it for the show, but I was like the bouncing around, the too much. It's like, we get it. We get that it was I don't know. Anyways, yeah. If you're going to watch it, if you haven't watched it, take it with a grain of salt, because this is, well, if you're gonna watch anything, take it with a grain of salt. Okay, in terms of like the Ed Gein like references. The show on Netflix is obviously not like this exact retelling of Ed Gein or the victims. And again, like I would be pretty upset if I was Bernice Warden's family, particularly like seeing this like romantic tie and almost like had like this angry, domineering, not really dominating. I don't know. I didn't like it. It felt icky to me. So I would be really upset with that. I feel like there was a lot, and that was one thing that did not to be dramatized. But again, why? What he did was, you know, unbelievable enough. They did focus on like the mental health aspect, which I did appreciate, but I felt like it took really long to get there. Like really long to like, there was like so much confusion of like unraveling up into that point. Whereas it would have been interesting to kind of like tackle that from like what mental health was like at that era. I think it was just like a missed opportunity. It was touched on, it definitely was, but like, I don't know. I will say that Charlie, maybe I'm just biased because like, gosh darn it, what a smoke show. And his performance was unreal. I know a lot of people are harping on like the voice that he chose for Ed, but I think that his explanation for it was really fascinating. He said that he was trying to like imagine that, you know, having your only influence and, you know, persona to mirror off of be your mother. And then you know, like the mother that like he had. And then on top of that, he himself is explained as just being like this very mild mannered, like polite, shy guy. And that's like kind of like how all of that came to be.
That voice that I use, just wanted to welcome her to town is all. grew out of my research, and the thing that I couldn't stop thinking about was Ed's burning desire to get the love and affection and acceptance from his mother that he never got, who was the only person he ever had a relationship with it in his life. And she told him every day for 41 years that she hated him because he'd not been born the daughter that she wanted.
All I wanted was a girl. Prayed and prayed to the good Lord for it, but was not his will.
So I thought, if you don't have any other contact with the outside world, you only have a relationship with one person, and that person tells you every day that she hates you because you're not a girl, what would that do psychologically and emotionally, and how would that manifest in the body? And so I thought this sort of gentle, high-pitched voice might be a way that Ed, gave permission to his mother to love him.
Now, there is a docuseries called Psycho, The Lost Tapes of Ed Gein, and it claims to feature never before heard recordings of Ed in a jailhouse interview soon after his arrest. Allegedly, these tapes were kept by a county judge, Boyd Clark, in his office until he died. And then at that point, they became public, or, somebody within that circle got them and then released them. And then these were featured on this show.
Well, how would you know when to go to the cemetery? Well, I have to think it. Somebody died in fact. What time of the year was this when you did this?
Anything.
Anytime.
Who helped you when you got him out of the grave? Nobody. Did they cave in on you?
Did, but they shouldn't, I guess. Well, which was the first grave that you had?
Yeah.
Adam. Okay. Did you know her? When she was alive?
Not really. No.
How long ago did you start?
Like I say, like 4 years.
And this woman come down 4 years since you've been into the grave, huh? I don't understand how you dig out the grave. Tell me how you do that. You would take the parts out and put her back in the coffin.
Yes.
And take the heads off.
Yes.
Then how would you, what would you do with the head?
That must have been taken from reading about these magazines and everything. Taking the flesh off like a headhunter.
Well, what parts would you take off?
That's inside.
The head and the sexual part. And you cut them out?
Yeah, not.
I struggle with stuff like that though, because I feel skeptical of things if I'm not able to trace back and see and cross-reference. But from what I heard of, this alleged recording, it's not as high as Charlie went, but I feel like there's definitely this similar polite, honest calmness to it, I guess. Yeah, but a lot of this is coming out with these tapes and this. And I just saw that Zach Baggins, he claims before the show, but he's re-advertising for people because obviously everyone's talking about Ed Gein right now, but he claims that he's got Ed's cauldron in his museum. As far as I know, there's no official chain to prove that it was Ed's. I mean, even a lot of just the files and the evidence photos were completely destroyed. So I feel if you see things like that, I don't know, it's a recreation inspired by reenactment, especially with the evidence photos. I mean, you can look online and be this is the crime scene photos of, what was found in Ed Gein's house. And as far as I know, there's nothing. That was replicas or reenactments or something, an actual other crime scene that looked, or body, that looked similar. Like I said, the farmhouse was even destroyed. So it's even anything that was in there, the cauldron's weird to me because I'm as far as we know, we don't have a chain of custody there to prove its authenticity. Even Ed Gein's headstone is no longer marking his grave. He's just in an unmarked grave because people were going and taking breaking off pieces of his headstone and keeping it. And then someone even stole the entire headstone in June 2000. It was later recovered a year later, 2001 in Seattle, but it was never put back because authorities were just like, we are just going to keep on doing this. And maybe one day, you know, it's going to get in someone's hands where we don't find it. But I don't understand that. I am too superstitious. Like, I'm just like, why would you want that juju? What are we doing? I feel so creeped out about like any artifact that is that dark. Like, I love a good museum tour. I personally can't do like a murder tour or like a paranormal one. I would have to like literally just like sleep in a bed of sage for like the rest of my life. Like, that would be me, you know, like that like meme where it's like how stressed out are you? And like the person's just like sitting in like a bed of lavender, like up the nose and that would be me. Like, I would be like, oh my gosh, nope, I can't do it. I do know that they exist though. And I'm sure that there's like people with like not like intentions of like wanting to go in and like steal that type of stuff. I'm going to attach so that you can just pop in a TikTok that I came across of somebody who actually works for a museum with one of the only known pieces of evidence from Ed Gein's house. She does a really good job at debunking a lot of like stories about Ed and seems informative and as authentic as possible, answers like a lot of questions in the comments, even for questions that people have. I did see the mention of the cauldron, and I don't know if like when I had seen it, if she had, well, as far as I knew, like when I seen that post, she hadn't replied to it yet. So maybe by this point, like she had, but go over and check it out. I'll have like the video now so you guys can see it.
My name is Chloe. I run the Great Face Museum in Chicago and Savannah, Georgia. Our Savannah location actually houses the only public display of original material from the Ed Gein case. That includes original documents, that includes crime scene photos, some of which have never been made public, as well as the only known piece of evidence left to exist from the case. I mentioned earlier that we have the only public display of artifacts from the case, which includes documentation. So those documents came directly from the estate of the Wilimowski brothers. Joe and Alan Wilimowski both worked the case. Joe was the polygraph expert who conducted all the interviews with Gein. Alan was the ballistics expert who was also on the case, and he was also the crime scene photographer. So this is one of the many documents we got from Joe and Alan Wilimowski, and it's Joe's interviews with Ed Gein. And we can see that they're talking about specific items. This is a photo of one of the pages within the transcripts. I can't make myself smaller, so I'm just gonna get out of the way. But at the end, you can see Joe actually says, "Don't handle it, Eddie. It's soiled, it's dirty, it's in two pieces." That means that it was in that room with them. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the only known piece of evidence left from the case. Is it possible there's more out there? Sure. Because Joe and Alan, for whatever reason, kept this piece of evidence. So it's actually a keychain. It has a lock of a woman's hair on it. There is still scalp attached to this. And it has a little tab that has Ed Gein, his signature, address written on one side, the Shell service station address information on the back side. That Shell service station was actually right across the street from where Bernice Warden's hardware store was located.
And yeah, I thought that, I don't know, it just opens up your perspective to kind of all of those things of people just being like, I have this. I am curious about the car though. Once I heard that, I was like, where's the car? So now that's my focus on things as well. But I don't know. That's it for me today. I'm very, very curious about what you guys think, especially about like all these monsters series, because I know that this is like, there's just like people who are, you know, definitely like can't wait to like watch every one of them, big Ryan Murphy fans. And then there's a lot of people who do see it as unethical and damaging. I will say that like when the Jeffrey Dahmer one came out, there was like a point of me being like, okay, should I watch it? And then seeing all of like the hurt from his victims' surviving families that I was just like, ooh, I could not possibly. And so, yeah, I didn't even entertain, you know, the Eric and Lyle Menendez case either. And I don't know. Yeah, I felt so different about this one for whatever reason. I'm glad that we got to talk about it today though, and kind of like compare things with the little side quests and like the tie-ins and what did and didn't happen, and see and hear what you guys think about it. So be kind. I've been thinking about how I want to end, if I want to end by being like what I think about Ed Gein. I feel like it's kind of like obvious because I haven't been like super, super aggressive or like hard about it. I think maybe it's just because of like how I feel about mental health and talking about it and learning so much more like as the years go by. Like when you think about the time frame, then there was like so much age that was unknown, and kind of you're just like written off as like an absolute freak. And I mean, I will say, like, it ultimately did come out that Ed was very, very, very disturbed, but it makes you think about, had that conversation been much easier to have, not even just the conversation, but just like knowledge of treatment for somebody with schizophrenia, what that would have looked like on top of all of the other factors in his life, you know, like the abuse, that type of mother as well is something to factor in. I don't want to say a soft spot in terms of just like being like, oh, well, it is what it is, because no, there are real victims behind the things that he did. And even if he was not responsible for, you know, how the bodies of the graves that he dug up like died and got there, like that violation is just horrible and traumatic enough and wrong. I guess I do tend to kind of empathize and be able to, like, I get curious and I look into trying to understand, like, once we know for sure, like, kind of what the diagnosis is and like the mental health tie into it, it's almost kind of like a what could have been, what would have been. And yeah, for that, I guess, like I said, it's definitely tied like towards the end of the Monster series where that's acknowledged and talked about. And so I do think that the way that that was filmed in like kind of like that emotional tie can maybe like open up for people to maybe, you know, not understand him in any sense, but I mean, for like future generations and moving forward of like how we kind of tackle those things to prevent anything like this from even happening, right? Like if we can like see those signs and acknowledge it and like not have just like such a negative stigma about it and get people the help that they need, proper help, long-term help that they need, things like this wouldn't repeat themselves. But that's, I guess, kind of, I guess, where I'm feeling about the whole thing. Very curious to hear your thoughts. Again, please be kind. And yeah, that's it for me today. I love you guys so much. I will see you in the next video. I will miss you terribly. Until then, make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon.